the most famous stories in all of the Old Testament, if not in all of the Bible, is our subject of our next study, and that's the story of the flood. So go with me to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, we continue our study of the book of Genesis. Just a reminder, remember we had chapter 5, one of the most, if chapter 6 through 9, the flood is one of the most famous sections of the book of Genesis. Chapter 5 is probably the one most forgotten because it's just one of those genealogies. So and so lived so many years and begat so and he died, and then so it just goes through. A couple things jump out to us again in chapter 5. Couple names, most memorable ones among them, of course, is Enoch. Did not die, for God took him. And then, of course, Methuselah, who was always the trivia question, the oldest man who ever lived. But remember, not to knock Methuselah off of his post there, but 969 years is given, but that's not like he lived a whole lot longer than any of the other guys. They're 962, I think, is the second place. So he outlived them, but not by much. Even some of the other ones that lived. As we talked last time about maybe why that genealogy is there, a couple reasons possible is number one is the simplest one is it's just a quick bridge from Adam to Noah. Uh, the next big story after Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel is going to be Noah, and to kind of bridge that gap, we have chapter 5 of just going through those genealogies, Adam and so and so and so and so and so and so down to Noah. And so it's just a way to get us from there to there as kind of a bridge. Another possibility is, we talked about this last time, the last three words of each genealogical listing is, and he died. And maybe that emphasizes that penalty for sin is death. That generation after generation died again because of that sin. Maybe a couple other reasons for that genealogy there. But the last listing in chapter 5, verse 32 says, and Noah, was the son of Lamech, was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And of course, those are three names that we are familiar with. One more comment about that genealogy in chapter 5 before we move to our story in chapter 6 is again, there's no reason to assume that that's a complete list. It may be, it may not be. We know there are other genealogy lists in the Bible that aren't complete, that they skip generations. The genealogy of Christ is that way in the gospel accounts, that there's just some generation. There's no intent to deceive. It's just to abbreviate it, that sometimes you weren't important enough to make the list in that. And that kind of brings us to the point of history. And we're going to see that deeper as we get into particularly Noah, after Noah and Abraham, the idea of that's just the way history is. Particularly a specific history, that certain world events are just left out. And this is going to be the story of a family. The family that descends from Adam through Seth and Noah, and then through Abraham. And we're just interested in this one family. And so just think about it. If you were writing a history of your family, if I was writing a history of the Chapman family, there'd probably be things in that history that I wouldn't mention that are major events. I may never mention the moon landing because, to my knowledge, none of my ancestors ever walked on the moon. If it got a mention, it might be that, a family member was watching it on TV. But other than that, as big of an event as the moon landing never would make my history book because it just didn't involve my family. And so that's the way that this story is. We're interested in these people and sometimes people who interacted with those people. We talk about the Egyptians, not because Egypt was a major world power, which it was, but that's not why they're in the Bible. They're in the Bible because they interacted with the people who were in the Bible. So that's the story of that and all of the genealogies. Chapter 6 begins, "Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth," and that's what they were supposed to do, "and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." And God's going to be upset with this, as we're going to read, and this is the kind of the segue, the introduction into the destruction of the flood. Numerous, for centuries, have been debate about this section of Scripture as to who are these daughters of men and who are the sons of God. That we're going to have a mixed marriage, a mixed relationship here. We just don't know why it's mixed and what these terms necessarily mean. The two biggest, most popular explanations of this are that the sons of God are angels and the daughters of men are human females, and that somehow these, it's assumed, these fallen angels, some that fell in the rebellion of Satan, come down to earth and have relations with these women and give birth to this breed of, almost like superheroes kind of thing. And that's one explanation. The strongest argument in favor of that would be that that phrase sons of God sometimes in Scripture does refer to angels. Now, to be fair, sometimes it just refers to people, but sometimes that's an expression that's used to refer to angels. We're going to read in verse 4 about the New King James calls them giants. And so there's the second thing that, oh, that explains how this super race of people, these giants were born, was through that mixture. There's a lot of problems with that explanation, of course. The biggest, well, let me ask you, can you think of some objection you would have to that other than it just kind of seems outlandish? But would there be some biblical statement that would make that maybe implausible? Jesus in the New Testament, remember, when challenged on the subject of the resurrection, says that angels aren't given to marriage. And so it seems to be that there's a prohibition against that, or an inability, however you want to word that, that maybe would not jive with that interpretation. The other interpretation, and there's numerous, but there seems to be two most feasible, would be one that I would take, that the sons of God just refers to those who were seeking after God. And the daughters of men would be those who were not seeking after God, who were concerned about men. Now, you could press that further, and some do, and think that the sons of God may have been the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men, the descendants of Cain. And maybe kind of makes sense, but I don't know that there's a sense in a need to press it to those maybe uh, genetic lines like that. It's just simply sons of God refers to those who are following after God, daughters of men, that those who did not. Now, that tracks with what we see later in Scripture. Remember, when God makes a covenant with Israel, he forbids them from marrying into these other nations who were not serving after God, because this same thing might happen. And so that kind of tracks with that later prohibition that's not, of course, spelled out here, but maybe tracks with that. What I find interesting, and whether this is intentional or coincidental, is that the language here somewhat mirrors the language of Eve's sin. You remember what it says about Eve and that fruit that she saw, that it was good for food, desirable. She saw it and took it. Those two words are used here. Notice again in verse 2, the sons of God saw, that's the same word that Eve saw the fruit of that forbidden tree, and they took. those wives. Now, again, whether that's just coincidental, those are fairly common verbs to be used. And so it could just be a coincidence, but maybe some kind of parallel in there of the idea of being driven by just our lust, our desire of what we see. And an argument that I would make in favor of that this is just talking about all human beings, some that follow God and some that don't, because in verse 3, the result of this, the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." And so God is upset at this intermarrying. And he's upset at man. No indication he's upset at the angels. He's upset at Satan, who led this rebellion of angels who came to earth and had relations with these humans. He's upset with the humans, and he's going to destroy the humans. And so, again, it seemed to me that would argue that he's talking about both groups of people being humans. Now, what does he mean when he says his days shall be 120 years? Okay, he's cutting it short. He's not cutting short. This isn't, and you first read that, you might think, oh, well, Methuselah and those lived 900 years. Now he's saying they're only going to live 120 years. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that that's when the judgment is going to come. 120 years from this point is when the flood is going to come. And so the flood doesn't, although it happens just a few verses later, it's going to actually happen 100. So in 120 years, man is going to cease to exist other than the ones that I save in the flood. Nick?
Men being the faithful and the unfaithful, the ungodly, and they marry. You see how that can wreck the godliness of that person.
Yeah.
Moral corrupt, bad company, corrupt good morals. You can see that all through the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, Moses' law. You weren't supposed to marry outside of Israel. And Paul warns about it again. Why would you yoke yourself with someone? I mean, if that's the case, then you can see the very beginning right here how terrible it was.
Yeah.
For anybody, and that nation or for relationship or whatever, how detrimental it is. It's godly to yoke with the ungodly.
Yeah, and sadly, so many times, not always, we all know of exceptions to that, to where somebody has married into a Christian family and became Christians. But the trend seems to be otherwise, and you're right, that explains the prohibition against Israelites marrying the idolatrous nations. So God says, okay, that's it. I'm going to destroy them. His days are numbered, we would say. Now, verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. So, a lot to unpack there in verse 4. Some, again, some connect this and say, see, there had to be something about this union. It wasn't just godly versus ungodly, because godly people and ungodly people have babies. They're just babies. There's nothing extraordinary about them. But if angels and human beings had babies, then that's where the giants would come from. Well, maybe those who see that are connecting dots that aren't intended to be connected. These giants, and we'll talk more about that later, there's nothing in verse 4 that indicates these giants were the offspring of these marriages. They just happen at the same time. It seems to me that this is more of a time stamp than it is these marriages happened and then these giants were the offspring of that. It doesn't have to be that that's the case. There were giants on the earth in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came in, and there were giants at the same time that this was going on. Doesn't necessarily mean that it was a cause and effect there. It was just that they were happening at the same time. Now, why the mention of these giants, these mighty men of old, men of renown, um, in the midst of this ungodliness? Let's start here in verse 4. Anybody have a translation? Again, New King James says there were giants on the earth in those days. Anybody have a translation or a center column note that uses a different word? The Nephilim. That's the Hebrew word that is there is Nephilim. That the New King James and apparently your translations as well have translated giants. It's a interesting word. The word Nephilim really doesn't mean giant in the sense in which we mean giant, somebody of large stature. The Hebrew word just literally means the fallen ones, are the mighty ones. And so the idea of mighty or even giant, although that's not necessarily the word that is used here. Now, let me say this first. I'm not saying they weren't giants. We know that Goliath, because we were given the stature of Goliath, that he was a giant in the sense in which we mean giant, overgrown oaf, because his dimensions are given. But the idea of the term Nephilim doesn't necessarily mean someone who's 8, 9 feet tall. It means a fallen one. Now, what does fallen mean? Does it mean they fell in battle? Does it mean they've fallen spiritually? That would maybe track with the idea of what's being talked about in this context. They are referred to the mighty men of renown. And so the idea of this giant or mighty men might just simply refer to that, mighty could refer to somebody who's mighty big, but it also could just refer to somebody who was powerful. And so it may simply, so in other words, the idea or the word giant isn't really in here. I know it. You think, well, yeah, it is. My Bible says giant, but this Nephilim, and again, Nephilim means fallen ones, or could mean mighty ones. But mighty doesn't have to refer to again the stature. Um, we even again, I don't want to press the word giant too much, but we even use the word giant in different ways when we talk about somebody as a giant of industry. Or a giant among men, we don't necessarily mean his stature, just mean his power. And so what it seems to me that he's saying here is that here's a description of how bad the world was. Godly people were marrying ungodly people, and there were these men of renown, these fallen ones that I take to maybe mean spiritually fallen, that were there in that day. And as a result, verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. What a description of how bad it was. And we can take some solace in this, and that is that as bad as it is, as we think it is today, it's been worse. And I think I maybe have referenced this before, that sometimes we have a skewed, limited view of history, that we think, history started out in the Garden of Eden, and ever since then, it's just gone down. And so 2025 is the worst it's ever been. And 2026 is going to be worse. And then, that's simply not an accurate portrait of history. Now, I understand why we feel that way. It may have tracked that way in your lifetime. You may think that things are morally worse now than they ever have been in my lifetime, maybe even your parents' and your grandparents' lifetime, when they talk about the morals and the ethics and so yeah, in your view of history, it's tracked that way, but that's not an accurate view of history. I think I would argue that first century Roman culture was worse and more ungodly than what we're experiencing today. And certainly in Noah's day, it was worse. I don't know what the population, some scholars have tried to speculate, but it's just a guess. I don't know what the population of the earth was in Genesis chapter 6. And so, but I have to assume that there were only 8 people worth saving. So whatever that percentage was, I think the percentages are higher today. I would hope there's 8 people in this building that are worth saving. not just the whole world, but just in this building tonight. So even on a percentage per capita basis, it's not as bad as it was then, but it was bad. So bad that God now says that he was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And so I will destroy man. In fact, he just said 120 years. I will destroy man whom I have created from the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I have made them. And so what God is basically going to do is I'm just going to start over. I'm just going to wipe the slates clean. I think of of Etch a Sketch. You're just going to shake it and just start all over with this. And so that's what we're seeing here, is that if you could track the population between from Adam to Noah, think about how exponentially, if you ever studied genealogy, you know that. Think about how many great, 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 great grandparents you have. And you can see how this, it works backwards, it works forwards as well, this exponential growth. And it's just going to be pared down to just 4 couples that are there, and they're going to start all over. And so we know this, but it's interesting to even to talk about it, even though it's a common sense kind of thing. We can all, if we were able to, we could track our genealogy, our family tree back to Adam, but we could also track it back to Noah. That we all descended from Noah and Mrs. Noah, and either Shem, Ham, and Japheth, depending upon where your family tree came from, what part of the world. You either are a Hamite, a Japhethite, or a Shemite in that descendants. And so God says, I'm just going to wipe it away and basically start all over. And so, in many senses, in fact, there's going to be some parallels in the language between the creation and the recreation that happens after the flood. So, in the midst of that horrible news and description of earth is one bright light, verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Some translations say found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so he mentions the genealogy of Noah, that he was a just man, perfect in his generations, blameless is the idea, or having an integrity. And let's talk just quickly about that word blameless, which maybe is a better translation than the word perfect there. The idea of blameless does not mean that Noah was sinless. Blameless, and we see that word in the New Testament, that someone who's to be an elder of the local church is to be blameless. Blameless doesn't mean that nobody accuses you of something, because we know that anybody can accuse anybody of anything. But what the idea of blameless means, it really carries with it a couple concepts. Number one is that accusation is just, there's nothing to it on its face, but also it carries with it also somewhat the idea of a reputation, and that is that when that accusation is raised about that person, that the people that know that person would go, no, no. And that carries with it the idea. So two senses. In reality, that person is blameless because they didn't do it. But also in the reputation sense, that it is blameless because someone might throw up some ridiculous accusation against someone else, but the people that really know that person immediately dismisses as being spurious. But then again, it's mentioned in verse 11, the earth was corrupt before God. It was filled with violence. God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way. All flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them on the earth. Many lessons, obviously, from the story of the flood, but here's maybe the first one that we want to note, is that God cares. God is not some distant being, so high and holy and distant and above us that he doesn't care. You notice it says he was grieved by this that happens. He's moved by the violence that is happening. That violence, and who was the violence happening to? It wasn't happening to God. It was happening to one another, and God cared about that. So God is moved and cares about what happens here. And we need to see that we have an involved, a caring, and a compassionate God. Mark? That's a good point. It says, "I was sorry that I made man." I don't know. I take that to be accommodative language. God's all knowing, even knowing the future. But just the idea of not God saying, "Well, I just wish I had never done this." It's more the idea of expressing his remorse in what has come of it. Yeah, to replenish it and start over with the goodness. And so we know famously, here's the outline of this section from chapter 6 through chapter 10. We're going to see that we see the wickedness and the judgment. We've just seen that. But Noah is the exception to that. Then God's going to have him prepare the ark. Then we have the flood itself, which includes Noah's deliverance. And then we're moving into them leaving the ark, God's covenant with the creation, that he's never going to do that again, not in that fashion at least. The sad story of Noah and his sons that immediately follow the flood. And then the genealogy picks up again with the nations that are descending from Noah. So we're going to look at that. So let's talk about Noah by the numbers, a lot of numbers in the story of Noah and the ark. How long was God going to wait? 120 years, it said. Again, that's not the changing of the lifespan of man individually, that's the lifespan of man collectively. 120 years, I'm going to bring this to an end. Other numbers are the dimensions of the ark. In chapter 6, verse 15, it gives it in the ancient dimensions 300 cubits, 50 cubits, and 30 cubits. Somebody help me. What is a cubit? Okay, 18 inches. Yeah, it was literally just from elbow to tip here. We rounded off as 18 because that's, kind of an average number, but it would have just been, if a carpenter today goes out to make something, he gets a tape and he measures it and does that. But then he would have just said, he'd have just used elbow to tip a finger, and that would have been a very inexact measurement, form of measurement. And so we usually just make up a figure. We do that with time, don't we? And when you get to the New Testament in particular, it talks about, the first hour, second hour, and we usually say that started at sunrise. And so we usually just attach 6 o'clock. Well, does the sun always rise at 6 o'clock? No, but it's close enough. And so we say 6 o'clock, and then we say the third hour would be 9 o'clock. Well, not exactly, but close enough. And the same way with the cubit. Is cubit always going to be 18 inches? No, but it's a good round figure to deal with. So it was literally just this, we believe at least, to be this measurement here that they would have used. Again, very inexact science at that time. So using that number, we come up with these modern day figures. 450 by 75 by 45 were the dimensions of the ark. How many levels? There were three stories to this. Doors and windows, one of each. And if we're real nitpicky, we could tear apart every piece of art, especially children's art that was done about the ark, because you can all see that picture of the ark and all these animals sticking their heads out the window. Got the giraffe, big long head, and the zebras over here, and they're all sticking their heads out of that looks real cute for the nursery for the children, but it's not historically accurate. There's one window and one door. Um, well, before we get into that, let's talk about that. I don't know if you've ever been to the Ark that's up in Kentucky outside of Cincinnati. It's worth going to. Deidre and I went several years ago. There's the Ark, and then the Creation Museum is very close. I'd recommend going to both of them. It's interesting. And what they do there is, and I think it's interesting what they do is they will say in their signage and their literature that we're not saying this is how it was. We're just saying it could be this way. Their point is to prove that it could be It's legitimate. It could work, and we've proven that it could work. Here's how it could have been. Not we know we've got the floor plans and all that figured out from that. But even there in that ark, and maybe I should have put a picture of it. Is the boat? It looks kind of like a boat today that has that front part, the bow, that's rounded and curved up. I first of all, I wasn't there. I don't know what it looks like either. But I don't think it probably didn't look like that because remember, this wasn't a boat. And I'm maybe not using the dictionary definition of terms here, but a boat is intended to navigate through the water. That's why it has that point at the front. It makes it easier to go. The ark wasn't going anywhere, was it, other than up? It's not like Noah was going, oh, I got to get over here, and so I need that to cut through the water. It just needed to float, and so probably it just looked like an oversized shoebox, rectangular in shape if you look at those dimensions. But all it needed to do was to float, and then come back down. It didn't need to go anywhere, which a boat does, and that's why a boat is shaped in different ways as a ship or a boat because it needs to travel through the water. If you needed a boat that just needed to float, you'd probably just build a box, and that's really what the word ark means. We read of 3 arks in the Bible, and they're all just flotation devices. Really, just a box, or 2 of them were flotation devices. One was just a box. Adam. Yeah, yeah. You didn't need a rudder. You didn't need a paddles or a motor or anything. Like I said, it was just a flotation. Uh, yeah, you didn't need anything other than the ability to not take on water. Is all it needed. Max.
Noah had to have miraculous help from God because he was trying to do the right thing to get this done. Because the, the idea of 4 able-bodied men and 4 women going out and cutting timber, stripping it down, making anything close to a plank out of it, and the more they built, further away the timber was getting. And maybe they hired the giants to help them. I don't know.
Yeah.
Other than just them building it, I think, to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah.
I couldn't do 4 able-bodied helpers.
Yeah. Now,
Two that they had.
sure. Now, to be fair, he'd have had about 100 years to do it, but still, but what we do know, and I use that word know maybe a little loosely, is that what it appears from the text that Noah didn't have to do is to go out with a horse and a rope and round up all these animals. That God filled the ark with the animals, and so yeah, there was some miraculous, providential, whatever term you want to use there, help by God in that. How many animals were taken on board? 2 of every unclean, 7 of every clean. We talked about this in a sermon recently. We fixate on the 2, but sometimes we forget about the 7. We don't know really what to make of the 7. Was that 7 and 7, or was that just 7 total, an odd number of those? Most likely that's what it was. The 2 is easy, male and female, it says, but the 7, the wording is a little vague there. You could interpret that to mean 7 male, 7 female, or 7 in total, which most likely that would have been the case. We need more of those clean animals because some are going to be offered as sacrifices. They're going to be given as food, and so we need more of those to begin with. Another thing, if you go up to Kentucky to the Ark there, that they do a good job of explaining that this didn't mean. Let's just simplify it and look at the 2. You think about two dogs. Well, that didn't mean that there were 2 Pekingese and 2 Dachshunds and 2 Collies, and you just needed 2 dogs. And the dog would include, wolf, coyote, everything that's of that variety, and that microevolution would have taken care of that as dogs evolved into different species kind of dogs. Same way with the horses. horse and a giraffe and all those kind of things not giraffe, zebra, that fit in that equine, mule, donkey, all of those. You just needed two of those. How many people were on board the ark? Of course, that's 8. How long did it rain? 40 days and 40 nights. We know that. Now, if you ask the common person on the street, how long was Noah in the ark? They're probably going to say 40 days, but that's not accurate. That's just how long it rained. Noah was in the ark for 370 days. Best way to remember that is just say barely over a year, because 370 is harder to remember than just barely over a year. And so they were in the ark for an extended period of time. Now, one thing that's not included in the numbers is there have been attempts to say that this was a localized flood, but all indications in Scripture that this was a universal worldwide flood. That's the language that is used. No reason to think otherwise. That was the case. And I don't think it's necessarily we have to assume that all of the water just came through rainfall. It talks about the idea of the breaking up from so it seems, and some would argue, well, it can't rain 40 days, no matter how hard it rains, to cover the whole earth. Well, 40 days and nights of a deluge is going to create quite a flood, but there may have been water coming up from other sources, as the text would indicate. So let's just assume that Noah kept a logbook, kept a diary. And we're going to see these entries. Now, the entry that I've made here are not the year that it was, like, December, what is it, the 10th, 2025. This is the month, the day of the month, and the year of Noah's life. And so this is not the calendar year. This is Noah's age, and the only thing we have to track it on, and then the month and the day of the month that is stated. So we don't know where it starts, but God announces this plan that we read here. And then the second month, when Noah is 600, so again, that helps us to see this. The second month, the 17th day, in the 600th year of Noah's life, it starts to rain, and they go inside the ark. Again, add 40 days to that. That's when the rain stops, 40 days and 40 nights. And then the 7th month and the 17th day, and so almost exactly 5 months after that, the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. Now, about that, just briefly, we don't know where Mount Ararat is. There is a Mount Ararat today, but we don't know whether it's the same. Maybe, maybe not. There's multiple names for mountains, and just like if I told you that I'm going to Springfield, you might assume I'm going to our Springfield, but how many Springfields are there in America? I might mean some other one. And so we simply just don't know the location, modern day location. The 10th month, and so the top of the mountains now began to be seen. We know this story, if you maybe cannot remember all the sequence of it, but in the 11th month, after God announces this, Noah sends out a raven, and it just comes back because there's no place for it to rest, which means the waters haven't receded enough. Sends out a dove, same thing happens, no place for it to set and to nest, and so it just comes back. Then in the 11th month and the 25th day, he sends out the third bird, the second dove, and it comes back, but it brings a fresh olive leaf, which tells us now vegetation is growing, the water has receded enough. And then the 12th month, the second day of that month, he sends out the third dove, fourth bird, and it doesn't come back. And so the only assumption we can make from that is it has found place to rest and to nest. The first month, so we've flipped the calendar here. Noah is now 601. The waters are dried up, and Noah removes the cover, opens the door basically to the ark. And in the second month, 27th day, so if you go back, you can see that this has been exactly a year and 10 days. Noah and his family finally leave the ark. And so that would have been Noah's journal, his logbook again, if he kept one of that. And so that's our sequence. And so we fast forwarded through the story of the flood there. We'll conclude this story, their exodus from the ark, and entertain any questions or comments about that flood when we reassemble next time.